Characters are scary. I often shy away from drawing them, leaning more into simple objects or monsters. And I do this because when I'm unconsciously working on my artwork, of course, I'm going to move away from things that might incur stress or anxiety. But we as humans empathize more and therefore connect more with characters, with faces, particularly with eyes and the emotion that can be shown there. So, finding a way to incorporate characters into your artwork is a lovely thing for pulling in an audience. Now, this doesn't need to be an internet audience. This can simply be yourself, your friends, your family when they take a look at your work. I've often found in my artwork, and certainly in my students' artwork over the years, that when you incorporate something that has eyes, when you incorporate a character that seems to have a mind and motivations, it's easier to imbibe of that piece. It's easier to feel a connection to it. So in this session, I'm adding a character to my scene, to a scene that I worked on for Inktober. And of course, this is going to be another prompt for that. The prompt in the background was exotic. I drew this odd kind of mushroomy thing. And I believe the character was included as part of Rome. She's roaming about, looking through this bizarre landscape and finding subtle joy in the strangeness of it. This is Andorra, a character that I seem to draw a lot. A character that revolved around most of my Inktober drawings in 2023 and in 2024. I think it's fun to have a singular character that shows up a lot. Back in the day, we called these OCs, original characters, and I think some of you may still know that term, though I think it has fallen into some level of obscurity. There's something intriguing about creating your own character, though. A character that you learn how to depict really well from a lot of different angles, one that you enjoy drawing so you don't feel like you need affirmation from other people when you work on them, and therefore one that you come to know and love and understand. It's something comfortable to fall back on as you draw. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Well, just shove the character in the foreground. You already know them pretty well. You can zoom out on them, zoom in on them. You understand how they work. In fact, many times when I do just simple sketches, I will add in a tiny little witchy character to show perspective, to show scale and size. And in the back of my mind, it's always her. It's always little Andorra. Now, I find it a little bit more important to sketch out characters. I will often dive into monsters or landscapes or bizarre eldritch things, but when I work on a character, I find that it is not only stress relieving, but it is actually a better process to get better results. This is probably because there is a lot of subtlety to the eyes, to the body language, to the mouth. In fact, on some of these drawings, because I'm working with ink, I mess things up and I go back with a white acrylic marker or pen to fix part of the expression. I'm not very good with expressions. I just haven't invested a ton of time there. Though I fear, for better or worse, that's going to be my job for 2025, is really to hone my character skills. Fortunately, I got a lot of time in 2024 to work on my pen techniques and creatures, and I will always work on those things because I love them. But I think as I move forward, as I want to bring comics to life and to illustrate my children's book, I am in need of character design skills that I do not currently possess. And of course, the only way to gain them is to practice. Obviously to do some research and to look into things, but mostly just to practice. But I would encourage you, as you are doing the same, to sketch out your characters first. There's nothing wrong with putting down some pencil lines and working over them and erasing them later. There's nothing wrong with using a sketch on a separate layer in Photoshop or Procreate. Sometimes we as artists like to shame one another, which is generally just a bad idea. But there is some shade thrown this way and that about the need to put down a sketch first or to use a lot of layers. And all of that is just absolute and utter nonsense, and you should ignore it. Including a character in your piece is going to be a little bit more stressful. So if you can find a way to engage with anything that makes it easier, I would encourage you to do so. I like this phase of the drawing. Once the initial sketch is there, I've blocked things in to some degree, and I feel a little bit more comfortable going in and starting to work in the textures and work in the shading. I love this brush pen for this purpose because it adds natural line variance. Some of the lines will be wider and thicker and others will be thin, and this looks like a human made it. I've run into a lot of times where I draw everything with the exact same width of pen, and I get to the end and it feels very mechanical. It feels artificial in some way, even though it's not. And I know that might be just a me feature, but art is fairly individualized, and so my strategy to fight that, at least in part, has been to add a material that forces me to be a little bit more loose with my line making. I think another thing that's incredibly important as you're applying characters to your work, though, is to think about something that characters naturally lend to your drawing and then exaggerate those things. And of course, that aspect is storytelling. Just simply having a character in a landscape brings it to life. Having a character riding your dragon or reacting to the scary thing in your piece allows for a human brain to get into those shoes, to understand what it might be like for the people in that scenario. In this one, for example, having Andorra walk through this space where she's in front of and behind different forms of weird fungus growing from the ground. She's looking off the page, looking at something we as the viewer cannot see. It adds to this level of intrigue and interest. In fact, even putting the camera lower down so we're looking up at her a little bit makes it feel like this world is vast. And she's, of course, dwarfed by this mushroom. Though if you've seen some of the other pieces from this strange underworld, this mushroom is actually quite small in comparison to some of the others. But this can be done in lots of ways. I haven't done a ton of it here, but there are some elements. Why is her staff the way it is? Why does she have the witch's hat? Well, maybe that's just her clothes. But what about the large pack on her back? Where is she going, and why is she content in the doing of it? If you're drawing a character, their clothing tells a story. Their expression tells a story. Scars and tattoos and jewelry on their body tell a story. Are they carrying anything? Do they have a weapon? Are they with anything else? And where are they located? If you were to draw your character on top of a mountain, it tells a different story than if they're on the top of a building. And whether that building is completely run down or pristine says something different about your environment and your world building. Whatever color the sky is going to communicate something too. Blues giving you some peace. Greens implying a sickly, eldritch sort of horror. And yellows, depending on their hue, either telling you it's a post-apocalyptic world or it's simply the sunrise. All of these storytelling elements are incredibly important. I actually spent a bit of time talking about this in a dedicated podcast a while back, which I can link below, but it's a really important aspect of artwork in general. In fact, I might go so far as to say the actual purpose of art in general is to tell a story. That when you go back and look at most pieces historically, when you look at the pieces that are in galleries, they all seem to tell some story. Sometimes the story is about the artist itself, who put that piece down and brought it into existence, but more often than not, it's a story that the audience pulls from it, whether it was intended or otherwise. When you look at old amphoras and mosaics from the Mediterranean, Greece, and Rome, each of them indicates something about that culture. It's loosely a historical tale and story, but it's also a story that the artist was trying to get across. Maybe they were just communicating something specific, maybe they were telling a story about mythology, but it doesn't particularly matter. They had something they were trying to get across, and I would argue that really is the crux of art. That is the purpose of art in a really broad sense. So try as you're working on including characters in your artwork to lean into that storytelling element. It already wants to be there. Your art wants to tell a story. A drawing of a rock is boring, but if there's a tiny little hole in the side that looks like a window and maybe an eye, well, now there's something happening there. Now it's more intriguing. Inktober has given me the opportunity to play with a lot of these things, to think about storytelling elements and how to incorporate them into my artwork a lot more recently. and it's a good thing. I think challenges like this, specifically challenges that give you a prompt that you have little to no control over, is really good for us as artists. It's something that we get from art classes when we're growing up or when we're younger generally, that we tend to fight. And yet, those assignments point us in directions that we would not naturally go and not go of our own volition. So I would encourage you, when you don't know what to work on, go find a random word generator or a prompt list somewhere of things to work on. Because when you extract that control from yourself, you put yourself in a scenario where you're going to draw things that you wouldn't normally. And you're going to learn things, therefore, that you wouldn't learn normally, and you're going to expand your horizons. And as it comes to expanding horizons, I want to focus on a strange final point here. We as artists tend to hone in on things. We tend to think that perspective or anatomy or shading, that those topics once mastered are going to dramatically improve our artwork. And this is true from a skill and a craft side of things, but I want to assert that these things matter far less than just making sure that your drawing is interesting. Now, this is a harder thing to examine, and I think that's part of the reason why we tend to focus on other things. It's easy to look at a drawing and understand whether the anatomy is better or worse than it was last week, how good it is in general, and yet, how do you judge how interesting something is? At a fundamental level, it has to do with how long someone is entertained by your piece. How long do they want to look at it? How long does it keep their attention? But there are a lot of little things you can do to make pieces more interesting. The first of which is just to sub out normal things for things that are a little strange. There's not a tree in this picture, for example. She's walking through a forest of mushrooms. This is something that is not normal in a, traditional world. And so it's by its nature more intriguing. Her clothes then, too, add something to this. She's not wearing normal clothes. She's got a giant witch's hat and a big staff. These things make the image more intriguing. And this image doesn't even have a ton of that. Whatever image you are working on, think about the things that you can sub out for more intriguing forms. If your character has a sword, sure, you could make it just a simple, normal sword, but what if there was something strange about the design of the blade? What if it looked like a serpent? What if the end of it opened up into the mouth of some crazy beast? Not like literally, but like the metal is sculpted in that fashion. What if your character has some elements to them that are just strange? What if they're missing an arm, or what if they have an extra one? What if part of their body has been replaced by cybernetics? Obviously, these elements are going to be based on whatever the world is that you're designing this character for, but sometimes you're just making something because it's fun. It's not necessarily embedded in a pre-designed world. So think about things that you can vary, that are just a little bit more intriguing. Things that still make sense in that setting, perhaps, but aren't what you would normally do. Contrary to this, though, try putting in things that make no sense. In some of my recent drawings, in fact, one that I'm thinking of right now that was a giant telescope, I have a chicken coop built onto the side of it. I have portions where there is some creature or eyes looking out from the interior. There is a bird cage being held on the side, or not a bird cage, a fish bowl. These things don't make any sense. Like they're not theoretical, they're not conceptual, they're just fun. I didn't really have any reason for putting them there except for they made me chuckle. And those kinds of inclusions can be really intriguing. They can add to the mystery and they can make people want to look at the drawing more and more because why is this here? So while it's important to include elements that make sense with your character and your setting, it's also fun, and for most of the time that we're working, totally applicable to just put things in that are odd and don't make a whole lot of sense. I've seen this in a lot of artwork over the last 20 years with like intense pop culture references, where you see a character that is in a grimdark setting and yet they have like a pin on their shirt that is an emoji, or they've got a keychain that has Pikachu on it. These kinds of things are intriguing, they're a little odd, they're a little out of the ordinary, they're not what you would anticipate, and therefore they make it more interesting. In fact, if you go back to old medieval and Renaissance paintings, some of the ones that have held on for all these years that still hold out as being particularly interesting and intriguing pieces often have elements like this. The inclusion of skulls in the pieces, of awkward motivations in the characters. Even the Mona Lisa itself has some enigmatic smile and some features that were not common for other paintings of the day. These kinds of things have always been part of our artistic ventures, and so I would encourage you, make your piece more interesting by adding bizarre elements that just don't quite make sense, but they make it interesting. This increases how much of a story there is behind your piece, and even if they're things that you haven't really done intentionally. I didn't necessarily know why I put a chicken coop on top of the telescope, but it allows the audience who looks at it to interpret it, to find their own way to understand it, and that's important too. It's important to tell the story that you want to tell, but it's also important to leave some loose ends and let the audience decipher something themselves. Well, as always, thanks for listening. I would love to hear what you're working on, what kind of characters you're designing, and also what you'd like me to cover in the next video of this kind. I've been spending some time recently actually talking about the drawings that I'm working on in the background as opposed to just rambling about some unrelated or mostly unrelated topic. And I would like to know if you would like me to keep going with this format or go back to the old one. As always, I'm making these videos not for myself, but for all of you, so your feedback really does matter, and thank you. Thank you also to my patrons who are on screen now. If you want to check out my Patreon, it's linked below. It gives you access to some additional videos, to voting on the content that comes out in the future. So it's helpful to me in those ways. In addition, we have a free Discord community attached to this channel, and you can find a link to it below. If you need some community, want to have some people to just share your excitement about your artwork with, whatever kind of artwork that is, or you would like some feedback on your work, I would encourage you to check out the Discord. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.